The day Callum finally said, no, his wife realized she had spent 12 years destroying the kindest man she had ever known. He had always said, "It's okay." When she forgot his birthday, he said it was okay. When she embarrassed him in front of her friends, he smiled and said it was okay. When she spent money they did not have because she wanted to impress people who barely cared about her, he quietly worked another weekend and said it was okay. But that afternoon, standing beside their kitchen window with a packed suitcase at his feet, Callum looked at the woman he had loved since his youth and calmly said the one word she had never expected to hear from him: "No, if you believe kindness still matters, forgiveness can heal broken hearts, hope can find its way through pain, and people deserve second chances." Please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share this story with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to our channel so our family can continue sharing stories that remind us what truly matters. Callum Mercer had never been the loudest person in a room. He was the kind of man people noticed only after he had quietly solved a problem nobody else wanted to touch. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a large community center, where he spent his days repairing broken doors, fixing leaking pipes, replacing damaged lights, and making sure elderly visitors could safely move through the building. He was patient by nature, gentle in his manner, and almost painfully willing to forgive. His wife, Marlo, had once loved that about him. When they first met, she was drawn to his calmness because her own life had always been filled with noise. Callum made her feel safe. He listened when she spoke, remembered small details about her dreams, and never laughed at the ambitions she was afraid to tell anyone else. When they married, he believed they were building something that would last forever. But somewhere along the way, Marlo began confusing Callum's patience with weakness. She wanted a larger house because her friends were buying larger houses. She wanted expensive clothes because she hated feeling ordinary. She wanted vacations, restaurant dinners, designer furniture, and a social life that looked impressive from the outside. Callum worked hard to keep their finances stable, but Marlo constantly complained that their life was too small. Whenever he tried to explain that they needed to save money, she accused him of lacking ambition. Whenever he came home exhausted, she reminded him that other husbands were earning more. And whenever he tried to tell her that her words hurt him, she would become defensive, apologize briefly, and then repeat the same behavior a few weeks later. Callum never shouted. He never insulted her. He never humiliated her in return. He simply swallowed his pain and said the same sentence every time: "It's okay." When Marlo forgot that Callum had arranged a special lunch for their anniversary because she had accepted an invitation from her friends, he told himself she was busy. When she criticized the modest car he drove even though it was reliable and fully paid for, he told himself she was under pressure. When she told her friends that Callum was too ordinary and predictable, he pretended he had not heard her. When she compared him to wealthier men, he worked harder. And when she began coming home from social gatherings carrying stories about men who were more successful, more fashionable, or more exciting, Callum quietly wondered what he could change about himself to become enough for the woman he had already given everything to. The breaking point began with something that seemed small. Marlo wanted to host an elaborate luncheon for several people from her professional circle. She believed the event could help her advance at work, and Callum agreed to help despite the expense. He repaired the patio, cleaned the garden, borrowed additional tables from the community center, and spent several mornings preparing the house while Marlo concentrated on choosing decorations and clothing. On the day of the luncheon, everything looked beautiful. The sunlight filled the backyard, flowers surrounded the tables, and the food was arranged perfectly. Callum stood in the kitchen wearing an old shirt with his sleeves rolled up, exhausted but pleased that everything had gone well. Then Marlo walked into the kitchen and looked at him with embarrassment. She told him he should not appear in front of her guests wearing clothes like that. Callum looked down at himself and understood immediately. He had spent the morning making sure her guests would feel comfortable, but she was ashamed of him. He changed his shirt without complaint and returned to helping. During the luncheon, he stayed mostly in the background. He carried plates, refilled drinks, fixed a chair when one broke, and made sure everyone had what they needed. But as he passed the patio, he overheard Marlowe talking about him. She described him as sweet but lacking ambition, a man who was content with an ordinary life. Her friends laughed, and one of them suggested that Marlowe deserved someone who could give her more. Callum stopped walking for a moment. He could have confronted them. He could have demanded an explanation. Instead, he returned to the kitchen, washed the remaining dishes, and quietly removed himself from the gathering. That afternoon, for the first time in years, he did not say it was okay. The next morning, Marlowe noticed something different. Callum was still polite, still calm, still helpful, but there was a distance in his eyes she had never seen before. He did not argue when she complained about the house. He simply listened. He did not defend himself when she criticized his work. He simply nodded. She assumed he was angry and expected him to eventually apologize for being distant. But days passed, and he remained quiet. Then weeks passed. Callum began spending his lunch breaks volunteering at a small rehabilitation center across town. He had always loved helping people, but now he needed somewhere his kindness could be useful without being taken for granted. At the rehabilitation center, Callum met an elderly former teacher named Agnes Whitmore, who had lost her mobility after an accident. Agnes noticed that Callum never rushed her and never treated her like a burden. He repaired the broken wheels on her chair, helped reorganize the reading room, and eventually began assisting with a literacy program for adults who had struggled to read throughout their lives. For the first time in years, Callum felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with money. He discovered that he still had dreams of his own. He wanted to create a community workshop where people could learn practical skills without worrying about their financial circumstances. The idea had been buried inside him for years because he had convinced himself that his wife's dreams mattered more than his. Meanwhile, Marlowe became increasingly unsettled by his silence. She had expected anger because anger would have given her something to fight against. Instead, Callum became strangely peaceful. He stopped trying to prove himself. He stopped checking whether she was pleased with him. He stopped apologizing for things that were not his fault. When she demanded that he cancel his volunteer work so he could attend another social event with her, he calmly declined. When she asked why he was becoming selfish, he told her that caring for himself was not selfish. Marlowe laughed at first because she thought he would eventually return to his old behavior. Then she discovered he had been quietly saving money for his workshop. She was furious. She accused him of hiding money from her and demanded to know why he had not told her. Callum explained that he had been saving for something he wanted to build, something meaningful to him. Marlowe reminded him that they were married and insisted that his plans should come after hers. Callum looked at her for a long moment before quietly saying that this was exactly why he had stopped telling her about his dreams. Those words frightened her more than an argument would have. For the first time, Marlowe understood that the marriage was not collapsing because Callum had suddenly become cold. It was collapsing because he had spent years becoming invisible. She began remembering all the times he had stood behind her while she accepted praise for things they had accomplished together. She remembered the weekends he had sacrificed to support her career. She remembered the birthdays she had forgotten. She remembered the way he used to look at her when she spoke about her dreams, before disappointment slowly replaced admiration in his eyes. But instead of immediately apologizing, Marlowe became defensive because admitting the truth would mean accepting responsibility for how deeply she had wounded him. Then an unexpected event changed everything. Marlowe lost her job. The company she worked for suddenly closed her department, leaving her without the status and income she had built her identity around. Within weeks, many of the people she considered close friends stopped answering her messages. Invitations disappeared. Calls became rare. The people who had once praised her expensive clothes and impressive lifestyle suddenly had no time for her. Marlowe returned home one afternoon carrying a box of belongings from her office, and for the first time she understood how quickly admiration could disappear when it was built on appearances. She expected Callum to remind her of every cruel thing she had said. Instead, he made her lunch, placed a glass of water beside her, and gave her space. He did not say "I told you so." He did not celebrate her failure. He simply treated her with the same kindness she had spent years taking for granted. That kindness broke something inside her. Marlo began looking at Callum differently. She noticed how early he woke, how carefully he managed their bills, how often he helped neighbors without expecting recognition. She saw him return from the rehabilitation center with paint on his hands and tiredness in his face, yet still stopped to repair the fence for an elderly neighbor. She began realizing that she had mistaken quietness for weakness when it had actually been strength. One afternoon, Marlo found a folder on the kitchen table. Inside were plans for Callum's community workshop. There were sketches, budgets, lists of donated tools, and letters from people promising to help. At the top was a simple handwritten sentence, "A place where nobody feels useless." Marlo sat down and cried. She realized that while she had spent years trying to make their life look impressive, Callum had been quietly trying to make other people's lives better. She remembered how often he had said it was okay, and suddenly the phrase sounded completely different. It had never meant that he was not hurt. It had meant that he had chosen forgiveness again and again, until forgiveness had become an excuse for everyone around him to keep hurting him. The next morning, Marlo approached him with tears in her eyes and finally admitted what she had refused to admit for years. She told him she had treated his patience like permission, his love like an obligation, and his silence like proof that he could never leave. She admitted that she had been so obsessed with appearing successful that she had failed to notice the man standing beside her was already giving her something money could never buy. She apologized without asking him to immediately forgive her. Callum listened quietly. Then he told her that he forgave her, but forgiveness did not mean pretending nothing had happened. It meant choosing not to carry hatred into the future. He explained that if they were going to rebuild their marriage, it could not be built on the old version of him who constantly said yes while his heart was breaking. He needed boundaries. He needed respect. He needed to be heard. And most importantly, he needed to know that his kindness would never again be mistaken for weakness. Marlo agreed. The following months were not easy. Forgiveness did not erase years of pain overnight. Marlo had to learn how to listen without defending herself. She had to learn that love was not about appearances, expensive gifts, or impressing strangers. Callum had to learn that speaking about pain before it became unbearable was just as important as being patient. Together, they attended counseling, rebuilt their finances, and slowly learned how to communicate without fear. The community workshop eventually opened on a bright spring afternoon. Callum stood outside the renovated building while people from the neighborhood gathered around him. There were donated tools inside, shelves filled with supplies, tables where people could repair furniture, learn basic skills, and help one another. Agnes was there in her wheelchair, smiling proudly. Marlo stood beside Callum, not in front of him, not trying to take credit, simply grateful to witness the dream he had once been too afraid to pursue. As people entered the workshop, Callum looked at his wife. She reached for his hand, and this time he held it not because he was afraid of losing her, but because he had finally learned that love should be chosen freely by two people who respect each other. Years earlier, he had believed being a good husband meant saying it was okay no matter how deeply he was hurt. Now he understood that real love sometimes requires the courage to say no. No to disrespect. No to being invisible. No to sacrificing your entire identity just to keep someone else comfortable. And sometimes, saying no is not the end of love. Sometimes it is the first honest step toward saving it. Marlo never forgot the afternoon Callum stood beside the kitchen window with his suitcase at his feet. She remembered how terrified she had been when he finally said no. But she also understood something she had never understood before: the man she thought she was losing had not disappeared that day. He had finally found himself. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you go, leave a meaningful comment telling us what you believe the lesson of Callum's story is. Can forgiveness survive without boundaries, or does true love sometimes require the courage to finally say no? In the end, Callum did not become a different man. He simply stopped hiding the man he had always been. He remained kind, but he learned to be honest. He remained forgiving, but he learned to protect his heart. He remained gentle, but he discovered that gentleness could stand beside strength. And Marlowe finally understood that the quietest person in the room is not always the weakest. Sometimes he is simply carrying the most pain without making a sound. Sometimes the person who keeps saying, "It's okay," is not saying that nothing hurts. Sometimes he is saying he loves you enough to forgive you one more time. But when that person finally says, "No," you should listen carefully, because it may be the sound of a broken heart finally choosing to live again.